In 1834, a painter named George Catlin rode into the heart of Comancheria with a column of United States dragoons. He had spent years documenting native nations across the continent, and he thought he had seen every kind of horsemanship the plains had to offer. Then a young Comanche man showed him something that Catlin would later say astonished him more than anything he had ever witnessed in his life. The warrior kicked his horse into a full gallop, and as he passed the soldiers, his body simply dropped. He slid down the side of the animal until he was almost invisible behind it. One heel hooked over the horse's spine, one arm looped through a braided rawhide sling woven into the mane. He was completely hidden, shielded entirely by 900 pounds of moving horseflesh, and he stayed there at a dead run. Then, from that impossible position, he rose up just enough to loose an arrow from under the horse's neck and dropped again before anyone could react. Catlin wrote that every young man in the tribe knew how to do this. Not the gifted few, every one of them. A Comanche warrior at full gallop could fire from beneath his horse's neck, over its back, or from behind its shoulder, all while carrying a bow, a rawhide shield, and a 14-foot lance, switching sides of the animal in an instant if the fight demanded it. To the soldiers watching, it did not look like riding. It looked like the horse and the man had somehow become a single weapon. That is exactly what they were. And it did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. What Catlin saw in 1834 was the finished result of a training system that began the moment a wild horse was caught on the open plains, and it began the moment a Comanche boy was old enough to sit upright. Nobody was born knowing how to vanish behind a running horse at full speed. It was built piece by piece over years, through a process so deliberate that outside observers spent decades trying to understand how it was even possible. So how did the Comanche take an untamed mustang running loose on the Llano Estacado and a small boy who could barely walk, and turn both of them, together, into the deadliest mounted fighting force the North American continent had ever seen? That is what this video is about. 7 stages of training that transformed horse and rider into a single living weapon. A system so effective that it built an empire covering 250,000 square miles and held off 3 different world powers for nearly 2 centuries. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand where the Comanche started. Before the 1600s, the people who would become the Comanche were a small offshoot of the Eastern Shoshone, living on foot in the mountain valleys of present-day Wyoming. They hunted small game, moved with the seasons, and held no particular power over anyone. Then, in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt drove Spanish colonists out of New Mexico, and in the chaos, thousands of Spanish horses scattered across the open country. Some were captured by Pueblo communities, some were traded north through Ute networks, and through those networks, a small, foot-bound people in the Rockies got their hands on the animal that would rewrite their entire future. What happened next was one of the fastest cultural transformations ever recorded on this continent. Within a single generation, the Comanche went from hunting on foot to producing the finest cavalry the plains had ever seen. By the early 1700s, French traders were already mapping them as a mounted nation. They pushed south out of Wyoming, drove the Apache out of territory those tribes had held for generations, and carved out Comancheria, a territory larger than France, stretching from the Arkansas River in Colorado down through the Texas Panhandle and into the Rio Grande Valley. A man's wealth in this new world was no longer measured in furs or land. It was measured in horses. A successful warrior might own dozens, sometimes hundreds, far more than he could ever ride in a single lifetime. But owning a horse and owning a war machine were 2 very different things. Here is how the Comanche closed that gap. Number 1. They chose the horse before they trained the horse. Comanche horses were not domestic animals, raised from birth in captivity. Almost all of them started as wild mustangs, descendants of the same Spanish stock that had scattered across the Southwest a century earlier, running free in herds across the open grassland. Capturing one required horsemanship in its own right. A hunting party would locate a herd and pursue it for miles, often for days, using their own already trained mounts to slowly wear the wild horses down, cutting off escape routes, driving them toward broken ground or water where a rope could finally be thrown. But not every captured horse was treated the same way. The Comanche recognized, long before European breeders formalized the idea that horses had distinct temperaments suited to different jobs. A calm, sturdy animal with stamina became a pack horse or a mount for everyday travel. A horse with explosive speed and a short fuse became a buffalo horse, trained specifically for the chaos of riding directly into a stampeding herd. And a rare handful, horses that combined speed, nerve, and an almost unnatural calm under pressure, were set aside to become war horses. These animals were never used for ordinary travel. They were kept fresh, rested, and ready for exactly one purpose. And a warrior might spend years finding, testing, and finally earning the trust of the one horse worthy of that role. Number 2. They broke the horse without breaking its spirit. The Comanche method of gentling a wild mustang was fast, physical, and in its own way remarkably precise. After a horse was roped, it would be worked to exhaustion, choked down gently with the lariat until it stopped fighting and dropped to the ground. At that moment, rather than continuing to dominate the animal through force, the handler would kneel down, hold the horse's head, and breathe directly into its nostrils. It sounds almost ceremonial, and in a sense it was. It was also the first moment of trust between horse and human, the animal's most sensitive sense, its sense of smell, being introduced to the person who now controlled its future. The rough hairs around the eyes were trimmed away to sharpen the horse's vision. A rawhide loop was fitted around the lower jaw as a simple hackamore, with no metal bit involved at any stage. Then came the part that separated Comanche horse training from almost anyone else on the continent. Rather than continuing to fight the animal into submission, the newly caught horse was tied loosely to a calm, already trained mare and simply turned loose to follow her. For days, sometimes longer, the wild horse lived alongside a gentle example, learning the rhythms of camp life, the presence of humans, the sound of dogs and children and cooking fires, entirely on its own terms. Only after that period of exposure would a rider actually mount it, and even then, the first mounting happened in deep water or soft sand, where a violent buck could not throw the rider hard enough to cause real injury, and where the horse's own effort was blunted by the resistance of the water or sand beneath its hooves. The goal was never to break the horse's will completely. A terrified animal with no spirit left in it made a poor hunting partner and an even worse war horse. The goal was cooperation, not conquest. Number 3. They trained the horse to answer to the knees because the hands were needed for war. This is the detail that made everything else possible. A Comanche warrior in combat needed both hands completely free, one for a bow or lance, the other for a rawhide shield. There was no room in that equation for reins held tight in a fist the way European cavalry rode. So Comanche horses were trained from their very first rides to respond almost entirely to leg pressure and shifts in the rider's weight. A squeeze of the left knee turned the horse left. A shift of weight back signaled a stop. The simple rope hackamore that replaced a metal bit was often dropped entirely once a horse was fully trained, looped loosely around the neck as a backup rather than a primary control. This single piece of training is what allowed a warrior to do what George Catlin watched in 1834. Guiding the horse with nothing but his legs and his balance, a Comanche fighter could drop to the animal's side, hang upside down along its ribs, fire a bow from an impossible angle, and still steer the horse through a full turn, all without ever touching a rein. European and American observers, trained in a tradition where the hands controlled the horse and the legs simply provided balance, found this almost impossible to believe the first time they saw it. Number 4. Boys trained for this every single day, starting years before they ever rode into battle. Comanche children were put on horseback almost as soon as they could sit upright. Some accounts suggest as early as age 4 or 5, and by 6 they were already riding independently. But childhood riding was not free play. It was structured, repetitive, and increasingly demanding, a curriculum built entirely around the skills a war horse and its rider would eventually need together. The training began with something deceptively simple. A boy riding at a walk would lean down and pick a small, light object off the ground without stopping his horse. As his balance improved, the pace increased. As his confidence grew, the objects got heavier and the ground got rougher. Eventually, older boys were practicing this same motion at a dead gallop, leaning almost completely off the side of a running horse to snatch something off the earth without losing a stride. The final stage of this drill was the one that mattered most in actual combat. Boys learned to lean down at a full gallop and lift an object the weight and awkwardness of an actual human body off the ground, using nothing but their own strength, their grip on the horse, and the animal's steady, trained gait beneath them. This was not a game. On the battlefield, it was the difference between leaving a wounded brother behind and pulling him up onto a moving horse in the middle of enemy fire. Comanche society placed enormous honor on retrieving the fallen, and that honor was only possible because the skill required to do it had already been drilled into a warrior's body since childhood, thousands of repetitions before it ever counted for something real.
Number 5. They taught the horse itself not to fear the chaos of battle. A brilliantly trained rider was worthless on top of an animal that panicked at the sound of gunfire or bolted at the smell of blood. So part of preparing a war horse was preparing it specifically for the sensory chaos of combat, something most domesticated horses of the era, including the cavalry mounts of the U.S. Army, were never properly conditioned for. Comanche war horses were gradually exposed to loud noise, sudden movement, the smell of blood from hunting, the press of other animals at close quarters during a buffalo run, and the general disorder of a camp under alarm. A horse that had spent years charging into stampeding buffalo herds, animals many times its own body weight thundering in every direction, was already remarkably difficult to spook by the time it ever faced enemy fire. This mattered enormously once firearms entered the equation. Historical accounts describe U.S. cavalry horses rearing, bolting, or freezing entirely at the crack of gunfire, throwing their riders into chaos at exactly the moment discipline mattered most. Comanche war horses, conditioned since their earliest training to hold steady through noise and disorder, gave their riders something European armies struggled for decades to replicate, a mount that stayed level-headed while the world around it fell apart. Number 6.
The best war horse was not property. It was closer to family. Among the dozens or even hundreds of horses a wealthy Comanche man might own, one animal stood apart. His personal war horse was ridden only in battle or on raids, never worn down with ordinary travel or hunting. This horse was often painted before combat, with symbols tied to the warrior's own visions and spiritual protections, handprints, hail marks, lightning streaks, each one carrying meaning specific to the man who applied it. Eagle feathers, believed to carry power connected to warfare, were sometimes braided into its mane or tail. At night, this was the animal a warrior might bring inside his own teepee rather than leave with the herd, close enough to hear its breathing, close enough that no enemy could steal it without waking him. On the southern plains, stealing a man's best horse was treated as seriously as an act of violence against him personally, and the reverse was equally true. A skilled warrior stealing horses from an enemy camp, sometimes dozens in a single night raid, was one of the most direct ways to damage a rival's fighting strength without a single shot fired. The bond between a Comanche warrior and his war horse was not sentimental decoration on top of a practical relationship. It was the practical relationship. A horse that trusted its rider completely, and a rider who had spent years earning that trust, was simply a more effective weapon than a horse and rider who were still strangers to each other.
Number 7.
Every maneuver was designed to turn the horse's body into the warrior's shield and weapon at once. Everything from the first 6 stages built toward this. The hanging maneuver George Catlin described was only the most visually startling example of a much broader combat system. Riding at full speed with a 14-foot lance balanced and ready required a horse that would not flinch or veer off course at the last instant. Firing arrows from beneath a horse's neck at a full gallop, sometimes described by witnesses as loosing 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot rifle once, required a horse trained to hold a straight, steady line through the noise and motion of a real fight, guided entirely by a rider's knees, while both of his hands were occupied with a bow. Comanche fighting groups also relied on tactics that demanded total trust in their mounts, working in coordination with each other. The feigned retreat sent a small group of riders charging an enemy line, then suddenly wheeling and fleeing as if broken, drawing pursuers forward into open ground where the rest of the war party lay waiting. Executing this convincingly, and then reversing direction again at exactly the right moment to spring the ambush, required horses that could change speed and direction instantly on cue, without hesitation, without confusion, in the middle of the most chaotic and dangerous moment a battle could produce. None of it worked without 7 years or more of accumulated training, standing behind a single instant of coordinated motion. By the time a Comanche warrior rode into his first real battle, the horse beneath him was not simply transportation to the fight. It carried years of deliberate breeding selection, patient gentling, thousands of childhood drills, careful desensitization to chaos, and in many cases, a bond closer to partnership than ownership. The horse Catlin watched in 1834, disappearing behind its rider's body at full gallop, was not performing a trick. It was executing a system that had been under construction since before that warrior could walk, and before that horse had ever felt a human hand. This is also why the destruction of Comanche horse herds, not battlefield defeat, was ultimately what broke their power on the southern plains. When Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's cavalry captured and slaughtered more than 1,000 Comanche horses at Palo Duro Canyon in 1874, they were not simply taking away transportation. They were dismantling a training system that had taken generations to build, one animal, one boy, one drill at a time, and that could not simply be replaced with a fresh herd of untrained mustangs the following spring. An army can rebuild its supply lines in a season. A relationship between a warrior and a war horse, refined since childhood, cannot be rebuilt nearly as fast. As of today, the Comanche Nation is headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma, with more than 17,000 enrolled members, and the horsemanship their ancestors perfected on the southern plains has never fully disappeared. Modern natural horsemanship, the training philosophy that emphasizes reading a horse's temperament, building trust before force, and communicating primarily through balance and pressure rather than the bit, echoes methods the Comanche were already using 2 centuries earlier. Historians and equestrian trainers still study George Catlin's paintings and letters as some of the earliest detailed European accounts of a riding system that, in its own time, looked less like animal training and more like something out of legend. The Comanche did not simply ride horses better than everyone around them. They built horse and rider into a single weapon, piece by piece, drill by drill, over a childhood and a lifetime. And for nearly 200 years, no army that met them on open ground ever figured out how to counter it in time. If you want to see what happened when the United States Army finally learned how to take that weapon apart, that video is